All right, hello guys. Today I'm here with my friend Aaron. Today we're going to be talking about various topics in the Middle East, going to what's been going on as of recent. So, Aaron, come on, introduce yourself.
Thanks a lot. It's great to be here. My name's Aaron Sobchak. Fairly recent graduate, and currently working at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. You can find me on Twitter at Aaron underscore SOBCZAK. And thanks a lot for having me again.
I mean, thanks for being here, and I'll have all of his information linked down below. So, Aaron, why don't we talk about some of the stuff you sent me earlier about what Mike Huckabee recently said about what's been going on in Gaza?
Yeah, so we've had really almost ever since, especially since October 7th, 2023. There's been on again, off again stints where Israel is not allowing for humanitarian aid to enter Gaza, you know, through different channels. The United States, right before Biden left, tried to pressure Israel through a letter, a 30-day warning. I believe it was 30-day warning, and of course, nothing or very little happened then. Various senators have tried to pressure the president. So there's been a couple instances of pressure, but with occasional lifts to the block of humanitarian aid. But these past almost 2 months, it seems to be about as bad as it's gotten. So Israel has reneged on its obligations through peace treaties, and especially after the first phase of the treaty recently, and now it's almost 2 months. Aid agencies have reported that no aid has gotten through, no humanitarian aid has gotten through, and it's been reports of children essentially surviving on one meal a day. The whole strip is on the brink of famine. Most aid agencies are not even operating in the strip anymore because of the danger, as well as the how it's technically illegal in many cases. So we've all kind of known this was going on through different aid agencies that have been reporting on it, as
Mm.
well as Israeli officials themselves admitting to it. What's most interesting, though, is that United States Ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, recently was pressured by the World Health Organization. He was pressured to do something about it, being the ambassador from the most powerful country in the world and Israel's strongest ally. Uh, Rather than addressing these issues in front of Netanyahu or the Knesset or any Israeli minister, he instead went to social media and made a video where he discussed he discussed the conflict and was frank about the reality about these blockades. He said aid's not flowing through channels, things of that nature. So he admitted that humanitarian aid is not getting into Gaza, that's blocked off. But instead of laying the blame at the government with the power, the government who is blocking that aid, he instead diverted everything to Hamas and kind of laid this narrative down, this easily debunked narrative that it's all because Hamas isn't accepting agreements and releasing hostages. And if only they would accept agreements and release hostages, then aid could flow again. But you and I both, I'm sure, understand why that's at least partially inconsistent, and I'd be happy to talk about that further later.
Yeah, for sure. And I feel that a great deal of this has to do with the rhetoric around conflating every person in Gaza as a Hamas member and the way they talk. And as you mentioned in your article earlier, when I was reading through it, which was really good, you brought up that he mentioned that there's no such thing as a Palestinian. So there are just Arabs. And I've always found that way of thinking to be very odd because, okay, there was no sovereign country called Palestine. Okay, fine, that is true. But there is also no country called Puerto Rico. And we don't just say there are no such thing as Puerto Ricans, they're just Hispanics. So, but to the point about aid, I agree fully with your point there. And I find this very confusing because Mike Huckabee is, I mean, a devout Christian. I don't personally know him, but I know people. I have mutual friends with him, so it's just kind of odd to see him being like this. And I frankly don't fully understand his motives and his reasoning behind this. What do you think it is?
Yeah, you brought up a couple of important things there. So let's see, going back to the idea, some statements he's made going back, I think 2008 and onward. He said that there's no such thing as a Palestinian. More recently, he commented that I believe he commented explicitly saying that the West Bank, there's no such thing as a West Bank, and it's called Judea and Samaria, which is the kind of the propaganda term that the Israeli government uses to discredit any attempts at a Palestinian state. So he did that, and I agree. It's obviously there's never been a sovereign, independent Palestinian state, despite modern attempts. That doesn't mean that the people there don't have a unique culture or identity. That doesn't mean they don't have the rights to self-determination, of course. And so it's really a blatant attempt at trying to erase their history. Now, why he's doing it, you mentioned the Christian aspect. You mentioned how you have friends who know him who talk about how he's a devout Christian. And, Mike Huckabee is someone who I remember tracking when I was, probably would have been high school or early undergrad, but he was running for president as a Republican a couple of different times, I think. He always tried to play...
Is this in 2016?
I think it was 2012 as well.
Okay.
I might be mistaken. But he always kind of tracked and tried to gravitate towards the evangelical Christian identity within the Republican Party. So really before Mike Pence was popular, he tried to corner that side of the primary, the Republican market. And but one of the big problems is whether you look at Mike Huckabee or Charlie Kirk or many evangelical Christians who may very well be devout and espouse important Christian doctrine, they get the issue of Israel very wrong from my perspective. And I think, frankly, when it comes to politicians, especially, it can, they can go into office with a pro-Israel stance, and then all it takes for them to turn a blind eye is a little bit of money from AIPAC or other Israel lobbies. So to convince them or to remind them why they're pro-Israel, I guess. But the evangelical community, someone who's grown up in an evangelical fundamentalist background, I certainly understand the want or the desire to read every prophecy in the Bible as coming in the future, and read every instance or mention of Israel as just either a present or future thing. But as someone who's still a Christian but views most of those prophecies as already occurring, it's very easy for me to kind of look at why evangelical dispensationalist Christians view Israel like they do, and maybe find it inconsistent with biblical prophecy or my particular hermeneutic. And like I said, I believe he probably is, or at least was, extremely devout, had these firm stances on Israel because he read it in the Bible or was told it by a Sunday school teacher. And like I said, all it takes now to avoid questions around humanitarian blockades or tens of thousands of civilians being killed is just either a high-ranking position like an ambassadorship, or of course, the potential of Israel lobby funds.
Yeah, I agree. And in regards to that, do you see any hope for the future in that? And do you think people are waking up more towards this issue?
I think young people especially are. There's been several polls that have come out recently. I believe Responsible Statecraft reported on one of them a few weeks ago, where young Americans, even young Republicans, are much less inclined to automatically support Israel than previous generations. And this isn't to say that Americans or young people shouldn't support Israel in any capacity, or shouldn't be inclined to support ideologically whatever country they want to support. But at the end of the day, when you have politicians with the American flag at their desk and then the Israel flag in their office as well, it's just kind of strange to have that dual loyalty. People talk about maybe Rashid Tlaib's dual loyalty, or the dual loyalty that some Latino immigrants might have when they enter the country. But when it comes to politics, there's really only one lobby that has enough power to convince politicians to have dual national flags almost very regularly in their offices. or wear perhaps their IDF uniforms to Congress. And it's not the Azerbaijan or the Azeri lobby or the Brazilian lobby. It's the Israeli lobby. So, and I think young Americans have woken up to that. Now, change that could come from that, I'm not really sure. I think we'll have to wait and see what happens after this current generation of politicians leave office. There are some bright spots, and at least some young politicians who came in espousing an America First philosophy, but maybe haven't held consistently. Like Dan Crenshaw, he came in as kind of an upsetter, but he's fallen very in line, even more so than some other Republicans. With the pro-Israel lobby.
He's very much a disappointment, Dan Crenshaw.
Right.
I used to like him a lot.
So we'll have to see how what happens when some of the older generations retire, like Mitch McConnell's retiring. Chuck Schumer is probably next in line. So as this next generation retires, and as younger people either get a stronger voice in politics or in the voting arena, we'll have to see. I will say one telling sign is, frankly, the loss of Kamala Harris. In some key swing states with progressive and Arab populations and voters, she waffled on the Israel-Palestine topic over and over again, taking maybe a barely more palatable stance than Biden was. And I think that lost her tens of thousands of votes in key states. And the next Democrat to run in 2028 is going to have to, look at that and figure out how they're going to address that issue, especially if tensions are still high in the area.
For sure. And on the right, I do see some hope. I do feel like that side going to specifically the not America First, Israel First, or Israel adjacent side has gone too far. And I feel like that's really pushed a lot of Americans on the right to open their eyes, specifically with the IHRA anti-Semitism bill. When people see that, it's just no different from woke laws saying that, hey, if you just speak simple truths, like saying that, hey, the Jews killed Jesus, that's anti-Semitic, right? And obviously anti-Semitism is wrong, but we do have a Second Amendment in this country. People are allowed to have bad ideas. And I think, and what gets me hopeful too is seeing, as you mentioned earlier, Charlie Kirk. I saw Charlie Kirk speaking up against this, who's a mainstream Christian figure, and he's someone who has a lot of impact on the right. I've seen Steven Crowder speaking up on this issue. So whether or not they're doing it out of good faith, I do believe Charlie's doing it out of good faith. But again, I don't claim to know anyone's heart. I think that gets me very excited and hopeful towards the future, because that's where I think the pendulum is swinging. And not saying that we have to be against any country per se, but if we're going to be America first, I believe we should put America's priorities first. Because if we do this with any other country, we always talk about how China controls our politicians, and they do, but we don't have politicians with Chinese flags on their desks. And if they did, people would be losing their minds, and correctly so. So I think on that issue, I'm hopeful for the future, maybe in 10 years down the line. I'm not so sure about the short term, so we'll just have to watch out and see. But in terms of what's going on right now, in terms of war, I want to get your thoughts on this, because right now I'm very mixed, because what was it? So with me being a Republican, you being a Libertarian, obviously you voted for Chase Oliver, I voted for Donald Trump, but one thing we both share in common is our Christian faith, and that we're both anti-war. And Donald Trump ran on no war, and 1 year he said that we don't have to bomb the Houthis in Yemen. 1 year ago, he was on Tim Pool's podcast talking about how it's very stupid that Joe Biden was bombing the Houthis in Yemen. He said, you don't have to drop bombs. He said, what happened to diplomacy? I can end a war with a phone call. And then for the first 2 months, Donald Trump seemed to be doing very well across the board. But then I would say it was sometime last month when he started bombing the Houthis when things started to seem to make a shift. He came into his presidency with a ceasefire, and then, which was something I wasn't even expecting, to be honest. And then here we are, ceasefire is over, we're bombing the Houthis, something specifically he said that we didn't have to do. And I'm not saying that these are good people or anything, but I am saying I don't believe in senseless wars for no reason that don't benefit us. So, Aaron, I kind of want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, let me address what you ended on with the censorship issue briefly, just to
Sure.
address that before moving on to the war topic.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, any type of government definition of hate speech or anti-Semitism, I think, is very dangerous. Of course, saying bigoted or not socially helpful things is certainly wrong. Or take a stance from against being hateful towards groups of people. That of course, should be a very easy thing to say. But you misspoke earlier. I'm sure you know it's the First Amendment that gives us our right to expression and.
Did I say Second Amendment?
You did. That's
oh,
okay.
my bad. I meant to say First Amendment.
Yeah, I figured. But it's the first. So we have the right to association, organization, and speech for that First Amendment, and that I don't think the founders gave us that just because they thought, well, it was kind of a nice thing to have. I think they recognized wisely that a state that had the power to censor political speech, especially, would grow too large and probably abuse that power. And Supreme Court has ruled on this time and time again. Snyder versus Phelps, I believe back in the 60s, was the Westboro Baptist Church was publicly protesting and loudly protesting against the funeral of, I believe it was against the homosexual. And the family brought the case all the way to the Supreme Court and said that they were inciting violence and using hate speech and all these things. The Supreme Court said what they're saying is bigoted, but they have every right to say it in the public space. And I think we have to stick firmly to that if we value a society where the state doesn't control the narrative. So in terms of other young, conservatives recognizing that, I do see some pushback. I don't know if it's going to be enough, honestly, because I do feel as though most Republicans are going to end up falling in line with the Trump agenda. Pam Bondi, as Attorney General, obviously is going to fall directly in line. I've only heard very bad things on Israel from Charlie Kirk, so unless maybe he's come out more recently and spoken about it and I haven't heard it yet, it's very possible.
So in regards to Charlie, it's not. What was it? He specifically was referring to the free speech issue. He hasn't changed.
It could be the case. I haven't heard that specifically,
okay.
But I'd be interested in listening to that. And then when it comes to foreign aid to other countries, I do see some hope there. Matt Walsh came out publicly and indicated that he didn't, have a particular dislike for Israel or anything, which I don't either. But he just indicated that the United States should be focused on its own financial health before it gives money to other countries. And I think that's a very good point. So I see some hope on the financial aid side of things, giving money to other countries. But in terms of our current presidency, I agree. We can move this forward to what you mentioned, the Trump and the war issue. I'm not going to lie, I was, tempted to vote for Trump because largely of his running on anti-war rhetoric. His first term wasn't great, but it also wasn't the worst when it comes to that issue, when it came to that issue. And seeing where we were with things in Ukraine and Russia ramping up, as well as Gaza and in Israel, it's not that I think Trump is some master negotiator or some genius, but I think he was speaking the way that a lot of people wanted to hear. He was speaking of peace, making deals, and getting the United States out of these senseless conflicts.
To your point right there,
yeah.
He was specifically, he was the only president I've ever heard, or politician, I guess, in the modern age, with his platform that would talk about war for what it is, talking about mass death. These are people dying. I think I heard Glenn Greenwald make that point where no other president really nowadays talks about the Ukraine war or anything like that, where you're talking about people dying, not just numbers. So, and I am optimistic about the Ukraine war, but I'm a little more concerned about everything else. But continue.
No, that's a good point. I would say he's the only politician, but he's definitely one of, if not the only modern president to, or major party presidential candidate to say that. Because obviously Ron Paul said that. AOC even said that, even if she's inconsistent, or Bernie Sanders says that. So he's not the only politician, but yeah, he had some good instincts, said some good things, went on some good podcasts where he was able to speak to people who were either war weary or skeptical of sending American money and soldiers overseas, rightfully so. Obviously, you had even Elon at one point like retweeting things like that, and Trump Jr. Retweeting things like that. That's one reason Dave Smith got on board. So, yes, Trump was signaling the right way, but at the end of the day, I think we discovered that he is still a politician. And he has gone with his second term. He has gone full steam ahead with a lot of his policies, a lot of his promises, rather, except for some of his better promises, which more specifically removing the United States from the war stage. There's been some reshuffling and some cuts to USAID, which I think in the long run will be helpful. But when it comes to like the Pentagon budget, just the other day he promised to increase the budget from about $850 billion to $1 trillion. That's not anti-war. He's giving out these contracting, it looks like he's giving out these military Pentagon contracts to his buddies, special interest buddies like Elon. He's mentioned the Golden Dome missile defense project, which is so nonsensical and a huge waste of money. So in terms of military spending, I don't see him as leaning that way. Now, the individual conflicts themselves, you're right. I think we should address them, more or less one at a time, because I think there is more progress in some areas than others. I think when it comes to Ukraine and Russia, he had good instincts. At least better than Biden, because Biden said he would never negotiate with Putin until Putin was willing to give in on every single issue. And that's just not how you win wars, or at least not how you negotiate an end to war. So Biden was foolhardy for saying that. So Trump at least has been willing to negotiate with Putin. Now, that means also putting pressure on Zelensky, right? Because Zelensky's been held up as this, majesty of democracy all over the Western countries. He's used to getting
messianic figure.
Yeah, almost. He's used to getting almost whatever he wants when he goes to Germany and France and even Biden's administration. So I think it's beneficial that Trump has been willing to put pressure on both sides. Obviously Russia still has all of these sanctions, and but has obviously the stronger military presence right now, advantage rather.
And I think that Putin has not that they like each other, but I think he has a degree of respect for Trump.
I would probably agree with that. I couldn't say for sure. I will say this most recent round, in this conflict, negotiations have been more. I kind of thought out of the conflicts, Trump might be able to pull a peace treaty here because of that respect that Putin and Trump seem to have for each other. But so far, we're not getting there. I think part of it is Zelensky is still holding on to promises from other NATO countries, whether or not they are even in the position to fulfill some of those promises. And I think that because of that, he's not quite ready to give in to some of Putin's requests or Trump's requests. But at the end of the day, the Trump administration has had issues with personnel. We got Marco Rubio as the Secretary of State, Witkoff, Hegseth. You have some a mixed bag of capable as well as not capable and experienced people, as well as more neoconservative leaning personnel and realists.
Such as Waltz.
Right. As well as realist personnel. So you have this mix. I think part of Trump's problem this time is he did indeed appoint some better people, but he couldn't get away from this, I don't want to call it deep state, but maybe managerial state, a class of people like Marco Rubio types.
I agree. I think one issue with him is I think he can be a bit too trusting of the people he has around him. And the reason I take issue with this is because I feel like Donald Trump has a unique opportunity that no president has ever had, because he's the first complete outsider to ever come in. So, and he was also a billionaire beforehand. And the reason I say it's unique is because he has on paper nothing to gain, right? So him coming in 2017, okay, he has nothing to gain. He's old, and he's a complete outsider, so he shouldn't be as beholden to certain interests. So he may
Well,
he may
you would
not be
think
to
that.
certain.
I said you would think that.
Right.
And maybe that was an angle at first that he did run on the angle at first, anyways. But we saw, in terms of being an outsider, he was an outsider from politics, but he had strong connections. He was a huge donor, a top donor to most of these politicians.
Oh, for sure, yeah. He talked about it.
Yeah. He talked about how he helps Marco Rubio win his elections, if I remember correctly. Or maybe it was Rand Paul, I don't remember. But yes, he was a political outsider, and that was part of his brand. It's part of why people voted for him. And I don't blame people for wanting something different from, especially if the option was Hillary or him, But at the end of the day, we see him acting like most politicians do, giving special privileges to his buddies. If we look at like defense contracts, him and Attorney General Bondi have announced plans to decrease sentencing or requirements around FARA laws, foreign agent laws, as well as donations from officials from other countries. And then you look at Elon Musk gives him hundreds of millions of dollars. Miriam Adelson gives him hundreds of millions of dollars. And then, he gets all this money, and then, he does what they want. With Musk, he's looking at giving him military contracts. With Adelson, he's looking at, previously, he gave a lot of concessions to Israel, whether it was recognizing Jerusalem as the capital or the Golan Heights, etc. And we'll see what he does this time.
And also, to your point with Adelson, I guess what kind of gets me here is I'm not saying it's morally correct, but I understand taking Adelson's money the first time around and then giving her what she wants to a certain extent. I'm not saying it's correct, but I'm saying I can understand it, right? But the second term, what does he have to lose? He's not going to run for a third term. He can take her money, win the election, and then just not hold up those promises. I get and kind of to what you mentioned earlier about expectations coming in and then just being status quo on certain issues. I heard Dave Smith talk about this, where he was bringing up that he couldn't think of a better pick for DNI than Tulsi. He couldn't pick a better head of the FBI than Kash Patel. And then now that they're in there, for sure they're better than whoever Biden had in there, but they're not what we were expecting. I don't think they're as radical as a shift as we were hoping for. With Kash Patel, we were promised Epstein files day one. We haven't really gotten those at all. We just got the fake Epstein files. And specifically with Tulsi's been very vocally anti-war throughout her whole political career. And then not seeing her push back enough or at all really in that group chat was pretty disappointing. In fact, it seemed like J.D. Vance was more reluctant towards bombing the Houthis than she was. So part of me wonders what exactly happens to when someone gets in there to kind of change them, or do they to make them not beholden to their principles, or did they truly ever hold those principles?
I couldn't speak specifically to that. Obviously, I could comment a little bit on Tulsi. I'm not super familiar with Kash; it's not my area of study or expertise. But Tulsi has, for the most part, been a good voice on peace and international restraint. She's had a noticeable blind spot, though, and that is with regards to Israel. She has made some, I would say, Islamophobic comments in the past. I don't think I'm not to say that she's not better than most of who Biden could have recommended, or most of who he reasonably could have gotten.
Right.
But to say that I'm not surprised, I guess, because why are we bombing the Houthis in the first place? Well, it's because the Houthis are bombing Israel and attempting to stand up to what Israel's doing. So we know why we're bombing the Houthis. They're not even attacking U.S. ships really anymore. It's more they're attacking Israeli assets. So and the Houthis have always been a thorn in Netanyahu's side. So to what extent different.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but they weren't attacking the ships during the ceasefire, right?
That's correct. They weren't. They didn't attack during the ceasefire, and then they promised to stop attacking as soon as another ceasefire was put into place. And that's kind of a whole other topic, but over and over again, whether it's Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, these aren't virtuous actors by any means, but they have a desire for a ceasefire, either because they're getting the crap beat out of them, or because they want to show that they have some kind of leverage in the negotiations. And over again, it's Israel especially that breaks these ceasefires. But that's a whole other topic, and the Houthis fall in that category. So I think that's why Tulsi, and maybe that, and just not wanting to go against some of her peers who have maybe more of Trump's ear than she does. Why most of the Trump administration has gone fairly hawkish on most of these issues, I'm not sure. Like you and I said, Ukraine, Russia, I see some hope, even if a lot of these negotiations are starting to falter. I still see some hope there. I think part of it's going to mean that Zelensky's going to have to get his hand out from the sand. And then when it comes to like NATO, the idea that the United States shouldn't be bankrolling Europe's security indefinitely forever, that's a perfectly fair thing to say. Even if the United States didn't leave NATO, just to say, Russia if to the extent that Russia is a threat, it is a threat to Europe, and Europe has the capacity to respond to that threat if they just push their economies in that direction. So this isn't to say we need to have a hyper militarized Europe all over again, but there's nothing wrong with saying Germany, France, United Kingdom, Italy, they can't defend themselves. I think Russia, it's a 10-1 GDP difference from the European Union to Russia. So there's no way they couldn't defend themselves from Russia. The United States, Trump is right for calling out some of these European leaders that have been freeloading, if you will, from off of United States defense capabilities.
That's true for sure. I mean, Russia has a GDP the size of New Jersey, from what I've heard. So, kind of towards everyone, to kind of go against what everyone's saying that they're the modern Soviet Union, that Putin's trying to build back the Soviet Union to what it was. I feel like he couldn't even do that if he wanted to.
Yeah, I think there's some truth there. Obviously, he has some regional allies. Iran and Russia signed, I don't know if it was exactly a defense pact, but it was a cooperation treaty. Obviously, you have Belarus and some separatists in Moldova. But if you look at Russia's, and then, people say China's not a strict ally of Russia. China knows it's very unwise right now to go formally in with cahoots with Russia, even if they still trade with each other. So if you look at the ally network that Russia has versus the ally network that Europe and the West have, it's not even comparable. So Russia can barely get through eastern Ukraine, and you're telling me Poland's next, the Baltics are next, France and Paris, it's not going to happen,
Exactly. Yeah, to your point too, when you brought up Iran earlier. So over the past month, we've been hearing, concerns about a potential strike on Iran, and some people very hopeful for that. And it seems like that's not going to happen, as Trump is in communications with, I forgot the guy's name, but the president or king of Iran, I don't know what they call him. So are you hopeful about that? I'm hoping that they come to some deal that we don't strike their facilities, because I've heard some people say if we strike their facilities, nothing's going to happen to us. And then I've heard others, and this is my personal belief, that if we do strike their facilities, that's going to get us into another war that we don't need to be in. And that'll result in a lot of Americans dead and a lot of other people dead. And again, no more. We don't want any more senseless wars. It's not what we voted for, and I don't think it's good for the country. What are your thoughts, Aaron?
Yeah, let's talk about Iran. So Trump's first administration, he was very hawkish towards Iran for most of it, right? He tore up President Obama's Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which most analysis from the liberal side of things to the realist side of things recognize that it was a fair agreement. Most international observers acknowledge that Iran was holding to most terms of the deal. And why wouldn't they want to? The plan allowed for a huge sanctions relief. It allowed Iran to start to reintegrate into the international community. And they just had to allow United Nations and I think EU observers to verify that they weren't enriching uranium for offensive purposes. And Iran complied, people can look this up, Iran complied widely with the requirements for that deal. Well, what happened? So Trump came into office and made up some claims about how this was allowing Iran to get too powerful. Iran was breaking the deal, all this kind of stuff, and just unilaterally took the United States out of it. And that was the first step in, I believe, the first step in a line of aggressive, hawkish positions or actions towards Iran. Obviously, we took out Soleimani, who was I believe their number one or number two ranking military official in the country. He was visiting another country, if I remember, he was in Syria for a meeting, and we assassinated him. We assassinated a military leader that we weren't at war with under Trump. Imagine if that happened to us. If Russia assassinated, or especially if Iran assassinated a four-star general while they were visiting a country overseas, we weren't at war with them. That would be huge. Trump would say no mercy. And, rightfully so. They assassinated one of our leaders we weren't at war with. So he did that. There was some action against Iranian ships off the Gulf of Hormuz. And then, of course, when he ripped up that plan, he reintroduced even more crippling sanctions on Iran. And all of this led to Iran being rightfully skeptical of the United States and ramping up both its, or at least of diplomacy with the United States. It ramped up its assistance towards its proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, and militias in Iraq and Syria, and Iraq rather, and Assad's assistance with Assad. And they began reportedly looking at nuclear enriching uranium again. And the Biden administration apparently tried to have nuclear talks with Iran or Iranian officials, but Iranian officials never trusted the Biden administration enough to do so. To get a new nuclear plan signed. It just never happened. So I think Iranian officials, Iranian society was suffering from whiplash, if you will, from the Obama administration seemingly agreeing to a good plan that was beneficial for all sides, and then the Trump administration ripping it up. And now we're back to Trump. So in terms of what the situation in Iran will look like, what's going on, it's hard to tell. You're right. I think it's important to acknowledge that at a certain point, Israel was pressuring the United States to attack Iran, and Israel wanted to attack Iran, but it looks like Trump or someone in the United States encouraged Israel, pressured Israel not to. And I think it's right, because it would have been a huge escalatory move for Israel to either attack any of Iran's civilian infrastructure, and especially for the United States to attack Iran.
I agree. And real quick, to your point, when you brought up Soleimani being killed, and I saw a clip of Ben Shapiro recently responding to Tucker, saying that, hey, well, when we killed Soleimani, nothing happened, right? So if we were to bomb their nuclear facilities, nothing would also happen. And I just see that as two, completely separate degrees of escalation. One is killing a leader in the military, that is something. I'm not saying it's nothing. But then two, bombing their infrastructure, local facilities, and just assuming, nothing's going to happen. I find that very hard to believe. I don't think someone as smart as him, I think he's too smart to even think that's true. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't, to the extent that Ben Shapiro is smart, I think he's borderline evil. But that comment on Iran, on Soleimani is telling. It's kind of telling that for him to say, we can kill international leaders with impunity, therefore we should do even more things with impunity, I don't think is a moral way or a sustainable way.
I agree.
To look at the world and how the United States acts. Now, Iran has consistently found itself being backed into a corner under different U.S. administrations as well as with Netanyahu. Israel has been successful the past couple of years at weakening Iran's proxy network or ally network, whatever you want to call it, as well as making Iran lose face itself. So you had, obviously Hezbollah. Israel is occupying parts of southern Lebanon right now, and says apparently that they're not going to accept a ceasefire there unless there's very unrealistic things that the Lebanese government does, or things that maybe can't even do. Obviously, you have Hamas. You also have the fall of Assad in Syria, and now Israel is occupying even more of southern Syria, southwest Syria than it was before. So I think Israel is in a place where it hasn't been in a while, where it sees itself as having a president who is almost unwavering in its support. The White House just released a statement the other day saying that Trump met with Netanyahu, and they agreed. I believe the quote was on every aspect.
Yeah, that had me concerned.
Every issue.
Every issue.
Yeah.
Listen, if I hear a president saying that about any country, I'm concerned.
Right, because the United States and Israel, it's not to say that we don't have any strategic interests or, goals that we can work towards, but to say you agree on every issue with a foreign country, we're not the same country. We have different issues or interests, naturally.
Exactly.
So it is interesting. Now, whether or not that's true or not, explicitly true will have to be seen. We both know that Trump sometimes says things.
Hopefully he's being hyperbolic in that statement.
Right. Trump is, if anything, very hyperbolic. Now, going back to Iran, you had all those proxies taken out, or weakened, and then you had kind of a back and forth spat between Iranian and Israeli missile strikes. Largely, but on both sides, the strikes avoided hitting too populated of areas. I believe the Iranian strikes had very low casualty numbers, and the worry was it was going to keep escalating into Israel hitting a nuclear site or a civilian area or infrastructure, something like that, or even worse, the United States doing it on Israel's behalf. So thank goodness cooler heads prevailed there. Not sure who in the administration encouraged Trump to make a good decision there, but thank goodness it happened. So now we're moving forward. There are talks, there are reports that the Trump administration and Iran have been having nuclear talks and peace talks back and forth.
Which is hopefully good.
Right, that could be great. We'll see what happens. But those reports are encouraging at the very least, because Ben Shapiro tweets out and says he doesn't like it. So that is, whenever Ben Shapiro says something he doesn't like internationally, it means it's probably a good thing. So the fact
probably
that
means if he doesn't like something on the international stage, it probably means it's good for America.
Right, probably. So the fact that the Trump administration is even boasting that it's having these negotiations, there's something to be said with Trump's idea of himself that he's a chief negotiator, so that he can negotiate with North Korea, China, Russia. Why not add Iran to that list and get a beneficial deal? So the hard thing will be the fact that the United States has to make concessions as well. As with any good negotiations, that both sides have to make concessions.
You don't.
And I think
the way you know you can make a good deal is that if both sides are a little bit unhappy.
Right. If there's something that happens that they wish hadn't happened, or that wasn't part of the deal. But unfortunately, the Trump administration, whether it's just posturing towards his base or just his personality, he doesn't seem to like conceding anything, even if he's blatantly wrong about something. So it'll be interesting to see if concessions happen. Obviously, we know Israel doesn't want to deal with Iran. Unless it's some kind of deal that would never happen, where Iran fully recognizes Israel and disarms itself, and all these things that would never happen. Israel doesn't want to deal with Iran. We know that Netanyahu has pressured politicians for decades, or Israel especially has pressured politicians for decades to go to war with Iran. This is one of Netanyahu's chief asks of Republican candidates, especially President Trump, is that they go to war with Iran. And like I said, back in Trump's first term, he escalated things. He did some hawkish things, but he avoided it. This time it's seeming maybe he's I don't know if he's directly refusing Netanyahu or if he's saying we'll wait and see to him. I don't know what exactly he's saying, but for now it seems like he's avoiding a direct war. And this isn't to say that if we attack Iran, that Iran will win a war with us, or there'll be Iran will nuke the East Coast or something like that. I don't think Iran is a serious threat to the United States in terms of affecting our homeland. But to say that it will be a quick and easy war is not true. To say that we can afford both like emotionally or physically to be in another long-term war in the Middle East, I think is not true. We're kind of just recovering from our withdrawal from Afghanistan, and we still have some troops in Iraq, but there's been talks about withdrawing them as well. So I think Americans, for the majority, want to be out of these wars in the Middle East. So,
real quick to that point,
yeah,
with Americans wanting to be out of these wars in the Middle East, if you look at every election, it's always the candidate who or almost always, the candidate that postures as being anti-war who ends up winning. I would say 2020 was the exception, but if you look at 2008, Obama, who ended up not being anti-war, he was very pro-war. It took us from 2 wars to 7. But during when he ran for his first election term, he came out as the anti-war candidate. He ran on ending the wars, which he didn't end up doing, and he ended up winning that election. And then in 2016 and 2024, Trump ran on the same thing, ending the wars. So that really shows that Americans are against ending the wars. They want wars over, even if they don't understand the intricacies of what's going on. And I don't think they'd be happy with us getting into another one. What makes Ukraine a little different is that, yes, those are human beings dying, but they're not Americans dying there. So I feel like a lot of Americans don't feel the brunt of that. They're not seeing their fathers go out and fight and die in these wars. But if we got into war with Iran, that would be different because we would be having our people go and die overseas.
Yeah, I think there's a healthy skepticism towards Americans going overseas. To the extent that it changes policy or affects what presidents do, I'm not exactly sure. Because you're right, Obama did posture as being a peacetime candidate. Other than his deal with Iran, I'm not sure where he succeeded as being a peacetime candidate. He had plenty.
I do believe he had a lot of carryovers from George Bush within his administration.
Of course, he had a lot of things to pick up from. But the U.S. was recovering from the War Hawk administration of George W. Bush, probably the worst or one of the worst modern presidents for civil liberties and war. That is especially so. Obama came in as a voice to try to say, we don't need to be doing all that anymore. And like you said, for the most part, he failed, if not made some things worse. Like I said, 2016, Trump, I don't know if Trump ran on a peace message in 2016. I guess he did mention the fact that he opposed the Iraq War. He definitely ran on the outsider position, kind of saying, I'm not the Joe Biden neocon, or not the Joe Biden or the John McCain neocon. But,
correct. He wasn't as hardcore on the anti-war stance in 2016 as he was in 2024. But to your point, when he brought up the Iraq War, he did on that national debate stage. He had bring up to Jeb Bush that they lied, saying that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and that we didn't need to go into that war, and which was a crazy thing for a Republican to even say on that stage in that point in time.
No, I agree, and I think Republicans especially are opposed or more skeptical of these wars when it comes to or because X, Y, and Z politician lied to us about it, which is a perfectly good thing, good reason to be skeptical of them. But when it comes to we need America to look strong, or we need to get revenge or attack these people who attacked us first, I think that's where a lot of the Republican base, who is maybe rhetorically anti-war or anti-entanglement, falls away. So obviously we see this in a big way after 9/11. Maybe no other big way in the modern times. But we see this with Iran. I think it's very easy for Trump to send out hypothetically a tweet and just say, Iran is threatening the United States in these ways, and we can't let them bully us. We have to show them. And then it doesn't take very long for that tweet to go viral and all of his base to suddenly not give a crap about whether or not we're involved in Iran anymore. So I think rhetorically there is almost maybe a disconnect. There are people that see wars of the past as being either wars of the political elite or wars we were lied to. They see their young sons and daughters go off and fight and die, or get come back with physical and mental injuries. But at the same time, from my perspective, as soon as Iran, as soon as the government tells us Iran's a threat or China's a threat, whether true or not, it won't take much for the American public to say, "Oh, it's okay. This will be a quick one." The politicians say this will be a quick one this time, and a war with Iran, especially China, would not be a quick one.
We know, and they're never quick ones. What we've seen,
right?
And even if it's a quick one, again, that's senseless death that we don't need it. And let's actually circle back a little bit. I want to talk about what's going on with Assad in Syria real quick. So, back in December, Bashar al-Assad was overthrown, and I think a lot of people were unaware of what the implications of that would be. But a lot of people were concerned, saying, "Hey, look, this is not a good thing. A lot of Christians are going to be killed." And even though this guy was not necessarily a good dude, he's better than the now Al-Qaeda leader who's taken over Syria. But then you had some other people on the right who were very excited about this and who said that, hey, this is a good thing because it does benefit a certain foreign country, but at the expense of the Christians in there. And then we saw this all manifest last month when we had 1,200 Christians get slaughtered, and a lot of people were shocked, surprised, and as horrific as it was, a lot of us saw it coming. We just noticed the patterns. We said, like, okay, well, if this guy takes over, if this guy's overthrown, we know that this is going to happen. So this is something I feel like you have probably a little more insight and knowledge on than I do. So I guess what can you tell us about this, Aaron, about this whole Assad situation in Syria?
Yeah, I'd love to comment how I can, and probably the last thing I can comment before I have to head out.
Sure.
But, so Assad was a strong ally of Iran and a partner with Putin's Russia. Not with Iran because he is Shia, he is Alawite and very different. But because Iran, the Shias in Iran, came to Assad and told him that they would be protectors of the Alawite minorities in the Middle East, with Syria holding the largest minority. Of course, allied with Putin, I think it was beneficial for him to do so at different points. Obviously, he saw the United States absolutely destroy Syria during the Civil War under Obama. Russia had military bases in the Middle East and Syria, so I think it was just a beneficial partnership. So you had Assad, a strong.
I want to pause real quick. Hold that thought.
Uh-huh.
So you brought up that he was friends with Iran and Putin, right?
Uh-huh.
And then two things that the neocons really do not like. I'm not saying those are good guys, but those are two buzzwords. And then also that under Obama, we really ravaged Syria and had troops in there. And then during Trump's first term, I think Trump made a lot of enemies through trying to get troops out of Syria, to the point where members of the Pentagon and the Deep State lied to him, saying that the troops were pulled out, and then they inevitably were not, and they remained in there. And yeah, I just wanted to make that. Let's continue on. I just wanted to bring those points up real quick because I think that helps kind of provide some context to where we are now.
Yeah, those are some good reminders. So the national intelligence establishment doesn't like Russia or Iran. Not saying there aren't good reasons to also not like or trust Russia or Iran. But Syria, for the most part, has always been a little demon or a partner of the axis of resistance or axis of evil. A willing and capable partner, but still a smaller partner. And yeah, it seems that John Bolton and other members of his administration lied to Trump or wouldn't follow Trump's direct orders to remove troops from Syria. We still have, I believe, around 1,000 troops in Syria. Either protecting,
Still do.
Yeah, we still
Okay.
do. And it's not, Trump very well could easily, I think, at this point, pull them out because he had experience with trying to before, and I think he knows how to this time if he wanted to. We will see if that happens. Now, back to Assad and what happened from my perspective. Assad had those allies. He saw this horrible civil war go on, but he still prevailed, even though during the civil war, we know that Israel funded Al-Qaeda-linked fighters in Syria to south to hurt Assad. Obviously, the United States funded extremist rebels to hurt Assad. We know this, even though they were called moderate rebels. Assad still prevailed, but it was very shaky. There were still portions of Syria, whether they were Kurdish or Turkish controlled, or the United States occupied, or either Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda spin-off groups that occupied or controlled certain parts of the country. But the central government was still recognized as, the government was still run by Assad. Damascus was still Assad's country. Now, so fast forward, it's what's interesting is that we have these kinds of conflicts going on almost in a proxy. I believe if you look at Sudan as an example, there were Russian-backed troops as well as Ukrainian-backed troops fighting in the civil war in Sudan. I believe in Syria it's the same way. There was Russian assistance given to Assad's government, as well as Ukrainian assistance given to rebels from Assad's government, the current administration. So it is interesting how you can connect the dots to some of these international conflicts and see almost proxy conflicts spring up from them. Now, Assad was dethroned very quickly. We don't know all of the details. We don't know how much, if any, at least I don't think we know yet, how much, if any, assistance the United States or Israel gave to the rebels that took over and kicked Assad out. It was just done very quickly, almost too, in a way that's too good to be true. So I would not be surprised if there's at least some intelligence sharing that allowed those rebels to consolidate and effectively kick out Assad. Now Assad is...
I 100% believe there's intelligence sharing.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say... we know there's always intelligence sharing between the United States and Israel, but in terms of the new government, I can't say that I know for sure, but I wouldn't be surprised. Now, in terms of the new government, to call them Al-Qaeda, I think, is a stretch, but to say that they benefited from Al-Qaeda organization, or that certain members, if not the president, is formerly Al-Qaeda, is true. So, say that there's no connections, that they weren't extremists before, is true. Sunni extremists. So, to be concerned, I think it's right to be concerned. And we saw some of that come into fruition, like you mentioned, where there's massacres of Christians and Alawite minorities in the western part of the country. So what I've spoken with some people who experienced that. What seems to have happened is that the current president of Syria, who was at least formerly extremist, wants to create a better image for Syria, regardless of his true intentions. He wants to create a better image for Syria. But some of his some of his generals and faction leaders still have that extremist bent, and they still hate Alawites because of, Assad was, like you said, effective, maybe not the best guy, but he still was, a dictator. So they still have hate in their hearts for Alawites, and so Alawites and Christians were targeted because of that. But it seems as though the president stepped in to stop further massacres. And there was, from some of the interviews that I conducted, there were kind of disagreements between how far to go with massacring or attacking Alawite and Christian villages in Syria. So I don't know how much of those massacres or violence are to blame on the president, or just some of the factions that he had to work with in order to create a government or in his military.
Yeah, I mean, to that point, kind of towards that, I was speaking to my friend who's Syrian, who has relatives who still live in Syria, and I was talking to him about this whole issue going on with the Christian persecution and massacre going on down there. And for some context, my friend is not a Christian. He's not, his family is not Muslim either. I forgot what religion they follow, but some other thing they have in Syria. And he mentioned to me that under Assad, things were a lot worse for his family, which I found interesting. I was expecting to hear the opposite. He said that, like, they had to be careful what they said on the phone, or else, like, if they misspoke against Assad or spoke against Assad, they'd be at risk of being jailed or killed. And when I told him about what's going on with the Christians in there and why Assad being gone is not a good thing, he said that it sounds like, well, maybe it's bad just for the Christians, which, I mean, as Christians ourselves, is still not good to hear. So that kind of perplexed me. So, like, I guess, what are your thoughts on that?
It's definitely not bad just for Christians. It's also bad for the Alawites. So the person I spoke
And
to,
I guess who are the Alawites for those who don't know?
yeah, so they are a ancient sect of people that Assad's family was part of. Assad was Alawite, his family was Alawite. They ruled the country. They're an ethnic and cultural minority. I believe they practice Islam still, but in a way that is different from Shia and Sunni, and they're considered more mystical, maybe even heretical to some Islamic sects. So,
Are they like Muslim Mormons?
I don't like know exactly for sure how to compare them to Christian denominations or Christian heretical groups, but I know that they're disliked in Syria, especially because they were a minority that was ruling the country, and the Sunni majority did not like them because of that. They were seen as being almost elitist. Now, the Alawites, so in terms of your friend saying he had to be careful what he said under Assad, things like that, I firmly believe that's probably the case. However, the person I talked to, who lives in an Alawite community, whose family is Alawite, says the exact same thing now. They have to be careful what they say, because they have friends and family members who have been picked up in prison without charge, disappeared. People have been killed who are Alawites in their villages. So it seems that this is not a uniquely Assad problem. It seems to me as though these factions genuinely have animosity towards each other, and that the government in charge, these factions of the government in charge, are tempted to continue this cycle of retribution. Now, what is really interesting about this current government ruling Syria is how much how much the West is suddenly willing to give them a chance just because they're not Assad, they're not Alawite ruled anymore, they're not aligned with Iran anymore, and how much they're letting Israel get away with in Syria.
Israel's taken some territory, right?
Right. So, this was Assad. Say what you will about Assad, but he was firmly tried his best to keep Syria's geographical integrity secure, even though we had the Kurd separatists to deal with, and Turkish encroachment to deal with, and American encroachment, and Israel action to deal with, and of course the other rebels in his country. But Israel has now expanded beyond the Golan Heights, which the United States recognized. It might have even been back in 2017. The United States recognized the Golan Heights as part of Syria, even though they were seized and annexed during wartime, so it's illegally illegitimate. Internationally illegitimate. They've now gone beyond that. They have begun seizing, or they may have completed seizing all of the United Nations buffer zone beyond the Golan Heights. So the United Nations set up a buffer zone in between the Golan Heights and the rest of Syria to try to make it with peacekeepers. Well, Israel has now taken that, and it has troops stationed, and I believe even civilians have started to have access to that area as well. The famous Mount Hermon is in that area. So there's that at the very least, and now we know that Israel has begun looking at operations even further into Syria's south. And if the new government of Syria was so proudly pro-Arab and proudly pro-Muslim, you'd think that they would be at least saying something against this encroachment on the part of Netanyahu's government. And I haven't seen anything from the new Syrian government. I've seen them as trying their best to legitimize themselves before Western governments, before the media. Rightfully so. It's a new government. They need to do that. But it seems as though they're just letting Israel take these chunks of southern Syria without any stopping, and Israel's doing it either because they're trying to get rid of militia weapons, or they're trying to protect Druze communities that are there. Even though most of the Druze communities have spoken out and said they don't want Israel's protection.
Which communities?
Druze,
Druze?
Druze. Yep.
Okay.
So they're a religious minority that exists primarily in Lebanon and Syria, in the Middle East.
So why would Israel feel necessary to protect these people, or to at least claim that they are?
Well, I think it's a cover-up. I don't think Israel cares very much about any people group other than the majority people group of Israel.
Okay.
And they more or less state that in their 2018 nation-state law. So I don't think that they care much about that. I think it's just a front for wanting to take more Syrian land and eventually attain this greater Israel vision, and make sure that their neighbors are weak and can't do anything to stop Israel's ambitions. Like I might have mentioned earlier, Lebanon is pretty much crippled. Obviously Hamas has no real capacity to fight back against Israel. Palestinian Authority is hopelessly corrupt and seemingly unable to stop Israel from its ambitions on claiming settlements in the West Bank. Iraq, we know, is too weak to do anything. Syria, now the new Syrian government, is seemingly unwilling to do anything. Turkey and Israel are work together on many things. So there's very little chance that Turkey would do anything serious to stop Israel. There are other countries in the Middle East that are already normalized peace with Israel through the Abraham Accords. So the Saudis, Trump desperately wants the Saudis to get in on that agreement, and I think the Saudis at least have economic interest in doing so. So really, Iran is probably the last player in the region that could and wants to seriously stand up against Israel. And Israel obviously doesn't like that. So Syria, I think, whether or not Israel had direct hand in Syria, they at the very least have to be very happy that it happened, that Assad fell, because they're taking more land in the south, and now it's one fewer power to resist Israel.
Right, and I'm glad you brought up the Greater Israel Mission, because not that I think it's going to happen, because I think it's just a bit ridiculous. But for those who don't know, I would encourage you to Google a map of Greater Israel. So that's just their vision of what they want for their country. So after they get rid of the West Bank and Gaza, they want to take parts of Israel, parts of Saudi Arabia, most of Iraq, all of Syria.
Well, I'm not exactly sure if that's official. I've seen that patch on some IDF uniforms. I'm not sure how official that desire, that exact map is, or if it's just some maybe really extremist IDF soldiers who had that patch made.
Okay.
I couldn't say, but I think at the very least Israel wants passive or friendly neighbors only, so that it can accomplish its regional hegemonic goals. To the extent that includes taking territory beyond the West Bank and Gaza, I'm not sure. But yeah, in terms of Greater Israel, what that more than likely means realistically is that it just wants its neighbors to be friendly and passive, or too weak to resist. That way Israel can just do whatever it wants to do.
For sure. And again, Israel being a foreign country can do what they want, but I don't believe that we should be supporting them in that. And also, kind of back to what we were talking about with Assad and Christian persecution. So are you hopeful that that's coming to an end with him getting his factions more control within his government?
Yeah, let me wrap up on the Israel thing, then I'll go back to Assad, and then
Sure.
we can wrap up here, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, you're good.
So yeah, in terms of what Israel's doing, most governments want to attain regional hegemony so they can do what they want. I don't think this is a uniquely Israel or even uniquely Netanyahu desire. However, like you said, they're a foreign country, a foreign government. I think it's foolish to think any government doesn't have desires to control more, or for personal or political desires. And I also think that the Israeli media, for example, covers Netanyahu's corruption very widely, while the United States media covers it very sparsely. So for us to treat Israel as a foreign country that has regional interests is totally fair, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. But for us to give it almost unchecked, endless amounts of money to assist it in doing so, I think is where one of the main problems comes up. Um,
And to the
yeah.
point where the amount of money we're giving them just doesn't simply make any economic sense.
Yeah, well, there has to be a return on investment. Like we so you can look at some of the grants and some of the partnerships we have with Israel. There are some uh, technological partnerships that we've done with Israel, some grants. But I mean, USAID gives has it's been found at least previously gave hundreds of millions of dollars to Israeli universities, while the Trump administration is threatening to cut off aid to U.S. universities because of their willingness to speak out against Israel on some instances. Not even all or all that many, but on some, or unwillingness to comply with certain arbitrary definitions of anti-Semitism, things like that. So the amount of money doesn't make economically sense, especially with where the United States is economically. With $37 almost trillion in debt right now, very few politicians speaking out against it, Republican or Democrat.
It's just Thomas Massey, pretty much.
Yeah, pretty much. We're bordering on recession, it seems, every year, or at least on a major one every year. So it doesn't make sense that with all that going on that we should therefore send, renew this agreement we have with Israel to send them hundreds of billions of dollars every year. So that's I guess a good wrap up on the Israel talk or the Israel portion of this. Israel is a sovereign state. There's has every right to be a sovereign state. Has every right to defend its borders. But to the extent that it encroaches on other countries, I think is morally dubious. Maybe not unique in the history of the world, but certainly morally dubious. And to the extent that the United States enables them financially to do so. At the cost of the taxpayer is, I think, something that should be really considered.
Yeah, for sure. I agree. Morally dubious, definitely not unique for a time in history. Right now, we're not living in an age of empires, but I believe that age will come back again in the future. But I want to get back to what you were talking about with Assad earlier. So, are you hopeful that the situation for Christians in Assad will get better? Or Christians in Syria.
Christians in Syria, yeah. I understood. I'm always hopeful. It seems like there's been a resurgence, whether it's just anecdotally on social media, of young people, even in the Middle East, returning to the faith,
right?
Or converting to the faith. Either way, maybe most people aren't aware of this. Most governments do not restrict people from being Christian. It's just how much they can proselytize, how much they can convert, or if there's other social pressures that are extra governmental, or if there's like terror groups that are extra governmental that persecute Christians that exist, certainly. But the governments themselves typically have religious freedom clauses to various extents. How much Syria will follow that, I'm unsure. Like I said, it seems that the current government wants to look legitimate in terms of to the rest of the world. I'm sure it would like to have sanctions removed. I believe it was taken off of Syria was taken off of the state sponsor of terror list. I could be wrong about that. I guess I'm hopeful that Christians would stop being persecuted. Maybe if Syria is given a chance to breathe and develop as a country once again, and factions are able to lay down their arms and see true peace, or see a chance for true peace, then Christians and Alawites can stop being persecuted in Syria. So I guess I'm hopeful, but not like super optimistic. I don't see it happening right away.
Okay, that's better than what I thought was going on. I truly hope that the persecution there ends, and kind of to what you mentioned earlier with Christianity growing in certain parts of the Middle East. I mean, I'm sure you've heard a lot about what's been going on in Iran, with the church growing in Iran despite persecution there. And, as you mentioned, a lot of Christians are allowed to practice in these countries, but they can't spread the faith. But the truth is that Scripture, Jesus calls us to the Great Commission, which is to go out and make disciples. So they're going to go out and spread the faith and risk their lives where it really costs something. So, but I am optimistic for what's happening there, especially for what I've been hearing about in Iran, in terms of growth of the Christian faith, and I'm hopeful for Syria that the best outcome comes out there. See, Aaron, we got a few more minutes before we got to wrap up. So is there anything else you'd like to touch upon?
No, I mean, I'm with you. I think that's important that the Christians in the United States look at the rest of the world and realize that there are strong Christian communities in other parts of the world who they need the support of the United States, maybe not directly through financial means, but at the very least, the United States should support partners who oppress Christians. Whether it's Israel or Azerbaijan or the Saudis, there are regimes, there are countries and parts of the world who do oppress Christians very strongly, and the United States has strong relationships with many of them. So I think it's important to recognize and remember that the Middle East is where our religion started. It's where Christ was born. Many of his followers in the West Bank, in the Levant, the greater Levant area, very likely have historical, ancestral connections to some of the very first Christians. And we shouldn't forget that when we hear of either Israel bombing the West Bank or taking settlements, or the potential for the United States to get involved in more wars over there. We shouldn't forget the very real civilian impact that it has, especially on already very fragile Christian communities. We look at the strong decreases in Christians in the Middle East over in prior years. You can look at maybe Syria. Syria used to have a very strong Christian community, much stronger than it is now. And then the civil war started, under the Obama administration, and Christians fled en masse from Syria. We see Christians fleeing from the West Bank right now. So these wars, these conflicts, they may serve our temporary regional interests. They may serve Israel's temporary regional interests. But at the end of the day, these are civilians. These are Christians like you and I. These are Christians who practice oftentimes an ancient form of their religion that have a strong connection to the very first Christians, and we should remember that.
I agree, and part of me used to struggle with when there's death, is it more tragic or less tragic when a Christian dies? Because when a Christian dies, they go to heaven. But then I'd also think it's maybe more tragic when a non-believer dies, because that person, we know is going to hell, and they don't have the opportunity for salvation anymore. So, but in regards to specifically in the Middle East, where there's such a small and fragile Christian population, I think that's very important that we protect these people, because they can go out and spread the gospel message to have potentially greater revival in their countries. And, these people are out there risking their lives to do it. And I think a lot of people are touched when they see Christians, believing and being open about their faith where it truly matters, where you could die for it. And I agree with what you said. We shouldn't be supporting countries that are harming Christians. We're always going to have to be diplomatic with countries that maybe don't do good things. But I think that's where we should draw the line. Are you persecuting Christians? Stop that, or we're not going to work with you. And in regards to Israel, I think it's a big pill to swallow for a lot of Christians to realize that Israel, maybe indirectly, has partaken in some Christian persecution.
Yeah, I think that topic of Israel, Christian persecution, either in or around Israel, is probably too big a topic to talk about this episode. But right. It's something to look more into. In terms of who the like you said, the United States being diplomatic with leaders of other countries who maybe act in unscrupulous ways is something that we have to do on the world stage. I would argue that persecuting, any religious or ethnic minority is something that we should oppose, and it just hits stronger. It hits home stronger for us because we are Christians. But that isn't to say that, if China or the Saudis persecute other minorities, that we should oppose that.
Uyghur Muslims.
Sure, or anyone being any minority being oppressed in other countries. It hits particularly strong for us, and I'm not sure I can say why, but Yeah, it's not to say that we should only look out for Christians who are being persecuted, but I do agree. I mean, it's a fragile population in the Middle East, a fragile Christian population, and the more civil wars that happen, the more political unrest that happens, the stronger likelihood that Christians will continue to flee the area.
Alrighty, Aaron. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. Where can people find you?
Yeah, so a lot of my writings on responsible statecraft is the website. It's the online publication for the Quincy Institute. I also am a pretty consistent contributor to the Mises Institute. If you Google that. Also, like I said earlier, I'm on Twitter. It's Aaron_SOBCZAK. But yes, Lon, it was great being on, and I hope to talk to you again.
All right, man. Thanks for coming on. Everyone, go check out his stuff. Like, subscribe. See ya.